Hi, welcome to Exploring Gnosticism Part 5. And today I thought we would start off by looking at Gnosticism in general just a little bit before we start into the Gospel of Thomas. Now, it might be interesting for us to note that apart from the Nag Hammadi texts, which again some were discovered in 1896, others in 1948, so very recently, for most of Christian history, the only place that we really could find a discussion on Gnostic beliefs was in the writings of Orthodox fathers who opposed their views. Remember that starting around the 4th century, when Christianity is legalized throughout the Roman Empire and eventually becomes the official religion of the state, what's going to happen is that Gnosticism and other traditions that don't hold strictly to the Orthodox view are going to be outlawed. They're going to be hunted down and persecuted. Well, these early church fathers then are going to be writing against what they perceive to be the heresies of these types of traditions. And so you had people such as Irenaeus, who wrote a work called Refutation and Overthrow of Gnosis, falsely so called, or simply against heresies. Hippolytus, who wrote a refutation of all heresies, and Tertullian, who wrote a treatise against heresies. Now, each of these individuals were writing with the express belief of showing that Gnosticism and other similar views are completely wrong and contrary to the Orthodox view of Christianity that we're all supposed to be following. But of course, since the point of these individuals is to refute these concepts because they were deemed dangerous, it means that what we're getting is a very skewed view throughout most of our history. People hear of Gnosticism from time to time, but they simply only see what the opposition wants them to see, and nothing more than that. The Orthodox tradition, of course, established a very strict hierarchy for Peter's Universal Catholic Church, modeled upon the hierarchy of heaven. The idea that there is one God in heaven, the strict code of monotheism, therefore there's only one supreme bishop, namely the Pope, who is going to then send his commands on to his subordinates. And so, just as we have in heaven, so we have again here on earth. That became the established view. But of course, we know that within Gnosticism, this is not necessarily the case. The faith is not strictly or 100% monotheistic, because as we've seen, there's the male aspect, the female counterpart of the divine. We have the idea that perhaps there is God as a Father who is divine and Jesus the Christ who is also divine. So it may not be, under their view, always a strict view of monotheism, such as what is being put forward by Universal Catholicism. Far more fascinating, though, I think, is the explanation of the Gnostic Belief, which is, of course, more Eastern Buddhist than it is Christian in many ways. And so from this, we're going to learn that Gnosis is to transcend beyond a symbol of the divine, to recognize the true divine, or rather the source of divine power, what they call the depth of all being. The God that is recognized is not the true God. Now that's a very interesting concept. If you think about it, we all have these images of what we perceive God to be. Some people perceive, a very ancient old man, such as you might find on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, or in a lot of artwork. Other people perceive God in a spirit form that maybe doesn't have a human body. Some people recognize him through the figure of Jesus. But we perceive what we take to be God. But these are human interpretations. These are man-made interpretations of what we think God is going to look like or resemble. We're told in the opening chapter of Genesis that God creates man in his own image. And, of course, the old adage is that we return the favor. And so we perceive God in the same way that we perceive ourselves, as a physical human body with head and arms and legs and so on. But that may in fact be very, very different from what the truth is. And so we have a perception of the truth that may not actually be the truth. So the God that is recognized is not the true God, according to the Gnostic beliefs. Gnosis is supposed to transcend beyond this mover sphere and define the real power. And this is meant to be a liberating experience. Just as in Buddhism, only a select few are going to comprehend the higher truth of sunyata. All the others are bound here to samsara, following the words and the rituals of man, but only recognizing these lower truths. We talked previously about Nagarjuna, and so I wanted to speak a little bit further about him, and I just wanted to read a passage here for you. The great Mahayana Buddhist Nagarjuna, who lived from roughly 150 to 250, explained that everything is empty, precisely because it's devoid of self-existence. In Eastern thought, a thing is not created from nothingness, and one does not speak of origins or cosmology. Rather, one speaks of the myriad things, the 10,000 things, all arising at once. The beginning and the end are both the illusion. So when the Buddha talks of universal causation, he means that each thing or each event depends upon another thing or event, and is relative to that thing or event. Likewise, truths are only relative or provisional. The world is illusion. Nagarjuna said that the higher truth of emptiness is to be experienced, but not described. It is something that through discipline a person can experience and understand, but he cannot explain it to anyone else. The words that would allow one to do so simply do not exist. By paradox, in the higher truth, all the lower relative truths, including those taught by the Buddha, disappear. The dualities of birth and death, and even the distinction between samsara and nirvana, will disappear as illusion. When one experiences emptiness, one transcends the illusion of the self and finds the true self, which is no self, and the true mind, which is no mind. Such a man has found contentment. However, without his higher knowledge, one is brought back into the world of samsara to suffer. It is the lack of real knowledge that brings about the illusion. So, according to Nagarjuna and the Buddhist tradition, there is a higher level of truth and a lower level of truth. Very similar to what we've seen in Plato and his idea of the realm of being and becoming. And so when we pin our knowledge on the things that we see around us, we are caught up in the illusion of Maya. We're caught up in the illusion of the material world. And we don't perceive that higher truth. So what a person has to be able to do is to somehow move or transcend beyond that level of man-made or physical understanding to receive that higher degree, that higher level of truth. Now, in the sense of Buddhism, that ultimate end goal is emptiness, sunyata, the non-existence of the universe. The fact that everything is illusion and that nothing is real. But in actuality, when we look at the idea of Gnosticism, Gnosis again means knowledge. And so this is what we're seeking here as well, is not just the earthly physical perception of reality, but the higher reality, the greater reality, the truth. The majority of people in the Christian world, and for that matter, probably in the Buddhist world, embrace these lower levels of truths that are offered by orthodoxy. But they're bound to ignorance. They're kept from the bliss of the kingdom of heaven. And only a select few will move beyond the words and be touched by that divine and truly know that higher truth. Within Buddhism, there is a phrase that if you want to become the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha. And what that means is that of course everybody has to have a starting point, right? You have to say, I want to become like the Buddha. I want to attain enlightenment. I want to gain this knowledge and this understanding. And you then start to develop a taste for the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and so on. But at some point, you have to let go of all of those things. You have to let go of all attachment to anything in this world, because anything that you are attached to is going to pull you right back into this world. So you can't allow yourself to be attached to people, to places, to things, to ideas, to property. And, you can't even be attached to the concept or the idea of being attached to something. And that's what it means when they say to become the Buddha, you must kill the Buddha. You can't allow yourself to become attached or fixated to anything. Because as soon as you say, I want to be like the Buddha, you're never going to be. Because that means you're attached to that idea of becoming like the Buddha. And once you become like the Buddha, or once you say, I want to be like the Buddha, then you're not like the Buddha, because you have attachment. You're not free. You're not liberated. Well, even though the phrase doesn't exist here, perhaps within Christianity, Christians should be prepared to kill the demiurge in the same way that the Buddhists are prepared to kill the Buddha. If I were to, hold on to these beliefs that the Catholic Church has presented to us to say, this is what I'm supposed to believe, this is what I'm supposed to hold as true, then I'm holding on to those lower level truths, and I'm never going to attain that higher level of understanding that should be mine. But if I want to become the Buddha, I must kill the Buddha. If I want to become the Christ, I must kill the demiurge. So to move beyond the lower truths and to embrace the higher truths, that is the transcendental source that we should be moving towards. For most, the structure and the order of the lower truths gives them something tangible to cling on to. But for the elite, who embrace the subjective, they can find something great. They can find the kingdom of God, which is going to come to pass. Now, the concept of the kingdom of God is found within Orthodox and Gnostic texts both. But the question becomes, what exactly do we mean by the kingdom of God? Well, we're going to need to turn to our primary text for today, which is the Gospel of Thomas, to really answer that. We should notice that what the gospel, what the kingdom of God implies is different depending upon what tradition you're following. In the Jewish tradition, the kingdom of God would be something that's established here on earth at the end of days. In the Orthodox tradition, the kingdom would be in heaven. For the Gnostics, however, the kingdom of God is not a specific place. It's merely a symbolic state of transformed consciousness. In other words, we're already in the kingdom of God right now. We just don't know it. We don't realize it. It's not a matter of transcending to another or going to another place. Some traditions would hold that, heaven is another planet, another place beyond. But if that's what it is, then why can't we reach it in a starship? If heaven is something that happens at the end of days, and what about all the people who have gone over the last millennia of life on this earth? What's happened to them? Where are they now? There's nowhere for them to go to? Is it a place? No. The Gnostics say it is not. It is a transformed state of consciousness. It's perceiving the world in a new light, seeing the world in a new way through the eyes of true knowledge, of genuine Gnosis, genuine wisdom. That's what the kingdom of God is. And so we're already here. We just don't realize it. So we're introduced here to the idea that we are reading the words of the living Jesus. However, not in the traditional gospel sense of dialogue, but rather in belief metaphors. We have these small little anecdotes that are being presented to us, these small aphorisms that are being presented to us. And in actuality, here's another east-west comparison. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, it has a feel very much like reading Confucius's Analects. You know, you pick up that text and it's going to say, Confucius says this, Confucius says that. And we hear these brief little pithy sayings that we can take on and apply meaning to and so on. Well, that's kind of the way the Gospel of Thomas is written. It's these allegories, these metaphors in that respect. But there's an element of ambiguity right at the beginning. And so when the Gospel of Thomas begins, it says, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Verse 1, "And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." Well, there's a little bit of ambiguity in that, right? Because when it says, "and he said," who are we talking about? Is this Jesus who says this? Is this Judas Didymus Thomas who is saying this? Who is it that's saying these words? And it's very important that we understand who is saying these words given what they're implying, right? Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Don't all human beings try in their best to push off death? Try to avoid it in some way? Many people argue that one of the reasons why faith is so strong is because it tells individuals that death is not the end, that there's something beyond it, that there's a life that we can travel to beyond, that we keep going. So we keep trying and trying to attain something beyond ourselves. One of the reasons why science and medicine continues to advance is because people are trying to find ways of forestalling death. We're afraid of death because we don't know it. It's the unknown. And so here it's telling us, look, if you understand what's being said properly, if you attain genuine gnosis, if you can transcend beyond and find this new state of consciousness, then you'll never die. That's something that's worth hearing. But are these the words that are being given to us? Is this the promise that's being given to us by Christ himself? Or are these the words that are being given to us by the author of the text? And it's very ambiguous in that respect. But most interpreters have said, yes, these are the words of Christ. This is the promise that's being made by him. So we take this to be Jesus' promise of eternal or everlasting life. But it may be simply Thomas's Gnostic pronouncement that salvation stems from secret knowledge, and nothing more than that. And so we turn to the second verse. Jesus said, so here we've got it clearly told to us. Jesus said, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over all." So the truth is troubling. Perhaps in Platonic fashion, reality is not what you believe it is, or in the Buddhist sense of transcending the relative truth for the ultimate truth. And in that fashion, we'll become troubled, we'll become astonished. It is both frightening and wonderful, all at the same time. In the early 20th century, there's a theologian, philosopher called Rudolf Otto, and he talked about a concept called the Mysterium Tremendum. And he said that basically when a person finds themselves in the presence of God, that individual is coming face to face with what he calls the Mysterium Tremendum, the tremendous mystery. It is a sense in which we are in complete and utter awe, because there's nothing like this that we've ever experienced before. There's nothing like this that we will ever experience again. We are completely other, separate, and apart from this thing. We are inferior in so many levels, and it is so powerful and beyond us. We just don't know. And so you're standing there in front of this thing, and there's so much power, there's so much energy, there's so much ability. But you yourself begin to feel more and more insignificant all the time. We can imagine, early travelers perhaps discovering Niagara Falls for the first time. And here is this mighty, majestic waterfall, the loud roar of it, the vision of it, the power of that water plunging over the top. And that person would be in utter awe, and they would realize in that moment how easily that waterfall could defeat them, could crush them into nothing. Well, that's kind of, on a small scale, the idea that Otto is talking about here. If we were to actually go to be able to see God, to be in His presence, we would feel something so powerful that it would frighten us. We would be afraid of the power of what it could do. But at the same time, we would be in such tremendous awe. It would be so wonderful. And so there's a wonderful mixture of feelings that comes into play when a person perceives this. But only when a person has come to that point where they experience it. And that's one of the key points here, both in Eastern philosophy as well as in Gnosticism, is that this is something that has to be experienced. The words are not going to really reveal what needs to be revealed. The words are not going to tell us everything that we need to hear, because the words can get in the way. And we have to experience it for ourselves. And when we do, it is so amazing. But words are going to fail us, and we won't be able to explain it to anyone else. We won't be able to tell anyone else what it is that we've perceived. That is the person who has experienced this. That is the one who may rule over the all. So what can we make of this? How should we rule over all? I mean, isn't that God's job to ultimately rule over all? Does this maybe imply a Platonic plan, aiming towards a philosopher, king, or queen, a person that rules with real knowledge, but still is below an ultimate power? Or does this imply maybe a Buddhist or a Hindu concept? What exactly do we mean here? Well, to know the truth is to know the source, the emptiness, or the Brahman. It's to discover that the true self and the true reality are only this source and nothing more. And so much like in the Zen koan, in which one is asked to show the face of the Buddha and is expected to show their own face, perhaps with Gnosticism, the Christian who is asked to show the face of Jesus or the face of God would ultimately show their own face as well. Perhaps in this way, this is how he rules over all, as the ultimate power. Maybe that is the ending point that we're looking for, that realization. Remember again, in Genesis it tells us that God creates man in his own image. Does that not imply then that just as God is eternal, man is eternal? Just as God has this ultimate power, mankind has this ultimate power. Just as God has authority, mankind also has authority. And so we become that figure who can then rule over all. And that seems to be the implication that's being made here. All right, well, I'm going to have to end at this point today, but we will be back next week in episode 6 to go in much more depth and detail into this fascinating Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. So join us then.